Welcome to the third lecture on software quality assurance. Today we're going to continue our discussion about the relationship between software process and software quality, but we're going to switch gears a little bit. Last time what I did was I spent some time talking about more traditional quality assurance practices and processes dating back to sort of the waterfall and moving forward through iterative and evolutionary development. And I talked about different types of quality assurance controls that you can use, and as well how the design of the process can actually ensure quality. So that was really to give you some context, but in this course we're going to spend most of our time actually talking about a particular type, or I guess approach to software development, which is agile software development. And this is what you'll be using in your course project, and it's actually I would say, arguably, if you think of agile software development as one type of development, it's probably one of the most popular, if not the most popular, development method that's used today in industry. And that's regardless of whether or not you sort of, even some processes which may not look fully agile will adopt some agile practices as well. There are different styles or different techniques for doing agile development, which we'll learn about. So things like you might have heard of Kanban, Scrum, extreme programming. These are all different flavors or variations on agile, but they all have very similar underlying values. So that's what we'll be talking about today, is how we do agile development. And as part of that discussion, I've asked you to watch two videos on Spotify's engineering culture, where they actually talk about some of the things they do. And I did that for today because they actually utilize an agile approach, and I wanted to be able to discuss that. So that'll be coming up in a few slides, and the video won't be recorded in my lecture for copyright purposes, but the link will be there, and I'd encourage you to go and watch those as supplemental information for this lecture. Okay, so the very first thing I have on this slide is I have something called the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. And back, I guess, when agile development wasn't even a thing, there were a number of people who were sort of, I guess, disillusioned with the way software development worked. And felt that it could be done better, and had ideas about how to improve that. And one of the things they did was a group of individual developers came together, and their names are all on the bottom here. They came together and they actually put together an Agile Manifesto about what they believed should be the values and the principles and practices for software development as they saw it. And you can still go see the original manifesto on agilemanifesto.org. And if you go and look at it, basically what they said is that we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. And they said this is done, we have come to value. These are the things that they value in software development. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Responding to change over following a really a very heavyweight plan. And the point that they were making is not that the things that are actually in this on the right side, things like tools, documentation, plans, are bad. Those aren't bad things. Those are in fact things that they also still valued. It's just that they felt that those things were being overvalued in traditional software development at the expense of those items on the left. And they felt the items on the left should be what we value more. And that was really sort of the underlying idea. And you might say, well, wait a sec, I don't see how I can take this and develop software based on this manifesto. And the idea, though, this manifesto wasn't advice for how you actually do software development. It wasn't a process. What it was a set of values that were meant to inform the creation of a new process or a new way of developing. So if you have these values in place ahead of time, then you will actually be able to be more thoughtful about how you actually develop your software and maybe come up with a better way of developing software. So, and just a reminder, I'm recording the lecture, and it'll be put up on the YouTube channel this evening. So you don't need to screenshot or anything what we're covering here. Okay, so that's a little bit about the manifesto. So a couple of other things here about, in addition to sort of values, they also identify what they call principles. And so you have values, principles, practices. So the values are sort of the high level, and the principles sort of get into more detail. So one of the things that I think you're going to recognize as being something you'll have heard about a lot is this idea about early and continuous delivery. So they said it's the highest priority is to satisfy customers through early continuous delivery of valuable software. That means getting a working version of the software to customers, getting it out as quickly as possible, and continuously delivering. So continuously updating that and adding to it all the time. So this notion about you wait 2 years for some monolithic version 1.0 to be released, that's not what they want. They want fast, and I guess not necessarily fast, but they want early and continuous in terms of how software is released. The other thing that they wanted to do was that they wanted to get away from this notion of the staged-based approach to development that we often see in waterfall, where you do all the requirements, or you do the majority of requirements right at the beginning before you do any design. And that, changing requirements is frowned upon, right? It's something that delays. They wanted to actually build in this notion about requirements being changed, even late in development, and harness change to give advantage. So if the environment changes, if the market changes, they wanted to be able to have a development process that could quickly adapt to those changing requirements and not actually set the customers back. So they wanted the fact that their development would actually be open to change to be a competitive advantage. The other thing is, and this one goes with this early and continuous delivery, is delivering working software frequently. So not only should the delivery be continuous, but it should also be frequent. So like every few weeks, for example, or every couple months, with an emphasis on shorter is better. The other thing that they wanted to do was they wanted to, remove a divide that sometimes happens where business side of a company and the developer side actually are isolated or divided, right? That they don't actually communicate well together. And they wanted to actually have a development practice where there's constant communication and engagement between different stakeholders, including business and developers, working together. They also wanted to create an environment where people were motivated to do the work and where people actually had trust in others and trust in their team to get the job done, right? They didn't want an environment where people were blamed for their mistakes, one where people were belittled. They wanted one where developers were actually seen as people and actually valued is really what they're getting at. The last principle I have here is the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. That's a really interesting one, especially in the light of the pandemic. And in terms of this, I think one of the keys here with this face-to-face conversation is, and I would probably say that, this is something with development teams that span the globe in some cases, where different developers are working at different times and so on. The key thing that you should take away from this is, I don't know if this is necessarily as a principle is one that is really essential to Agile. I think probably what's essential to Agile is the value of synchronous communication between the team, where the team are actually getting together as a group to discuss. And the fact that you actually value communication and you actually prioritize it, right? And this isn't about having really long, boring meetings. That's not how it is. And you'll find that most of the Agile, they actually do things to limit the lengths of meetings. So the idea that you meet more frequently and for less time. So make it valuable, don't make it long, right? A meeting isn't measured by how long it is. It's measured by how much value you get out of it. And then you might say, well, those are good principles, but it turns out there's actually more to it than this. There's actually a whole other page I have here of principles, and I'll just quickly mention them. Working software is the measure of progress. So remember we talked about metrics and ways of measuring the difference between what you're doing and what you should be doing. Well, in terms of progress as one of the things you want to measure, they view working software as the measurement. So if your software is working, then that means you're progressing. If you have software that's broke, that is a sign of lack of progress. And of course, and so that's something to keep in mind. I see a comment here about how do you ensure meetings are progressive or not boring at that. I'm going through right now principles, right? And what we're going to get to is, so we saw the values, and now these are principles that encapsulate those values. And then what we're going to get to is eventually is the different types of agile development all have practices that embody the principles and values as well. So when we get to the practice level, we can actually talk about specific practices that they do to ensure that the meeting, and you notice they didn't actually say meetings in that last bullet here. It said effective method of conveying information within a team is face-to-face conversation. They didn't say is, daily meetings. That's not what they're talking about. So we'll get to the idea of how do they actually frame communication as being effective or progressive, as was mentioned in the chat here. Another thing they talk about is promoting sustainable development, meaning that they should maintain a constant pace indefinitely. You shouldn't, the way you develop. So this idea that, we've got a deadline coming up. Everybody has to work 18, 20-hour days for the next 3, no one's going to get the weekend off. Like this, that's not a sustainable way of working where you ramp up and do a lot of hours, a lot of work right before you actually do a release. What they want to do is they want to promote development practices where there's a continuous, sustainable, so the work you're doing every day, you should basically have a similar day 2 months before before a major version versus a day before or a week before. And the thing is that's interesting is if you're doing continuous releases and early, this idea of having a major release every 3 months or every 8 months or every year, this kind of goes away a little bit, right? Because you're constantly doing these releases. So sustainable development. They also talk about the importance of technical excellence, good design, and how those things enhance agility in their way. They talk about simplicity, and I'm going to get back to simplicity when I go through the first agile development method at the end of this lecture or the second half of this lecture. But basically what they're talking about here is simplicity is something that's essential, right? You don't overcomplicate things in terms of how you design, how you program, or how you do any of the activities. If you keep it simple and effective is what you want. And they also talk about, they have this belief in self-organization amongst teams. So you don't structure the teams rigidly in ways where you put people together that you think are appropriate, regardless of their opinions. What you do instead is you let teams self-organize, and that will actually lead to better artifacts coming out of those teams, better products, so better designs, better requirements gathered, better architectures. And the other thing is they also buy into this idea of reflection, where at regular intervals the team should actually look at what they're doing and see how they can improve it, right? You don't just assume I'm doing the best I can, or I don't have time to stop and think about what I'm doing. I just need to get it done. You should build in time to reflect, because doing slight tune-ups, adjustments to your practices will actually potentially speed things up or increase the quality of work down the road. So this also helps you learn from your mistakes, right? If you're not reflecting and you make mistakes, you're going to make those mistakes again. And that's going to slow you down in the long run. So reflection and actually improving practice can be ways in which you can actually be more effective. Okay, so that's a little bit about the values and principles of Agile. That's sort of the more abstract, high-level thing that we're going to discuss today. And we're going to actually get into specific practices now. And there's a whole bunch of different types of development methods that embody the values and principles of Agile, and which are themselves considered to be Agile methods. One of the earliest ones, and that's why I'm going to talk about that one today, is something called extreme programming, or XP. That was actually a really popular one around, I guess, in the early 2000s. to mid 2000s even. It's still used in companies today, but it's largely, it isn't used to as widespread as some of the other ones that you'll see down this list. Specifically, Scrum and Kanban are both widely used now and are very popular. There are other ones such as the Crystal Agile framework, the Dynamic System Development Method, and the Feature-Driven Development that are also alternatives that have embodied Agile. We're not going to cover all of these. We're going to actually, in the class, cover most likely the first three. But I do want to use those as an example so you can understand. And you are free to utilize any of these when you're actually doing your course project. So before we go into talking about one of these development methods, though, what I wanted to do was sort of step aside a little bit from the lecture portion, and what I wanted to do was actually talk with you about the first case study we're going to really see in the course, which is about Spotify. And this is what I gave you as sort of some homework ahead of the course, or ahead of today's lecture, was I asked if you could watch these two videos on Spotify's engineering culture. And both these videos are about 12 to 13 minutes in length. And they're interesting videos, and they talk a lot about not just the culture, but they talk a little bit about the process and the practices. And what I wanted you to do was I wanted you to see what happens in a particular company, and I wanted you to be able to relate that to when we start talking about practices in different types of agile development methods. I want you to start relating what Spotify is doing to what those agile development methods recommend, and see if you see similarity, and you can see how it's different and so on. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to actually just pause the video so that we can take a look at these videos, or just a couple of clips of them, and then we'll resume when we actually discuss. So let's just pause here temporarily. Hi everyone, so we're back now, and after spending some time reviewing the first video, not the second one, just the first one, what we're actually going to do now is we're going to talk about your thoughts on this. So I've already told you what my thoughts are, is that Spotify is a nice example of a company that is building its practices even as they build them to scale, meaning build them for a large organization. They are still keeping in mind a number of the values and a number of the principles that you see in Agile, right? So things like people are valued more than other things. The idea that you do quick, small releases and so on. So I just want to also as well, they have this idea of sort of self-organization, cross-pollination between different squads, encouraging community over structure, and some other things. So I would love to hear what you think about this, and in relation to what we talked about with Agile at the beginning of the lecture. So you can either turn on your mic, put up your hand, turn on your mic, or you can write a comment in the chat. I see there's one thing here that somebody has commented, which is that it seems a bit idealistic. And, I would say that if you look at this, this is sort of the know what you should be doing kind of. This is what they set out as their goal. Whether or not there are times where what they do may not match, right? They want to do small releases, but they're going to hit roadblocks. There's going to be times, you saw the example of when they talked about different, I think it was across different squads where you have different groups, and it doesn't look actually perfectly aligned. It often looks very messy, and this changes and adapts. That's the reality of this in practice. And what you see here is that it is to a certain extent an idealized representation done so it looks nice in a video, but I think it's probably true to what their goal is here and what the values are as an organization, which is why it's called a culture. They talk about culture. Is the culture part here is their values. So this is an interesting, so somebody wrote, I think it's a good system and probably helps to prevent their employees from burning out as easily, which helps them to be more sustainable. Yeah, and I think that's something that's key here too about this idea of sustainable development, right? Building out a model where people have this continuous flow of work so that it isn't like you have lulls, peaks and valleys in your workload where during the peaks you're working every evening, every weekend with no breaks, and it's very stressful, right? So you want to keep it so that it's consistent. And I think that's a good point. Any other thoughts on this? Did people think this was relevant? Were they bored by it? See a few people saying they enjoyed it. Interesting, quite interesting. Okay. Any other thoughts that you had about the video or things that I maybe I didn't pull out that you'd like to discuss? See a few people saying it was nice to see a case study rather than just definitions. Found that the trust in the culture was really interesting. We also highlighted, I think I'm going to mention this in the video, so my apologies for saying it again. While I had the video paused and I was showing some clips from the Spotify YouTube video, one of the comments I did make was they made a comment in there about their focus on test automation as a way to make it easier to do releases and therefore to make releases easier to happen more often. And I pointed out that every time you actually do a release, whether you're doing a bug fix, whether you're doing a new feature, an optimization, whatever, you are actually going to have to test that release to make sure it works before you release it. And if the testing process happens to be manual or happens to be slow, then it's going to take longer, and therefore the release cycle, the time it takes for you to do a release, is going to be longer and it's going to be harder. So if you want to be able to do releases fast and make them easy, then using automation around activities like testing, which are required every time you do a release, will ensure that releases can happen more quickly, and the automation will ensure you don't make mistakes that can come up manually, and they can also ensure that it can be done in a more systematic way, which is also something you'd like to see in your software development. So things like doing automated testing are key to doing quick releases, and we'll talk a lot about testing later in the course. Someone said that they feel that the autonomy and lack of authority makes me nervous. And this is one of those things that's really interesting. So the idea that there is autonomy in these squads is true, and there is managers still, but the idea of servant leaders within each squad and is important. The other thing is this idea of alignment and the coupling. So the aligned squads that are loosely coupled that you see here in on the actual screen. Oh, sorry. I just realized I've been lecturing and didn't share back the lecture slides. I will do that now. But the thing that I wanted to point out was that by having the squads be aligned, if one squad isn't actually up to par or isn't doing what other squads need, they're going to hear about that from other squads, right? So the idea here is that there is sort of a little bit of a, I don't want to say policing is the wrong word, but there is sort of a peer pressure or a continuous feedback that you will get from other squads if you're not actually developing the features, if you're not actually doing what is expected of you as a squad and what your goal is. Because remember, all of these have a mission, they have actually goals that they have to achieve. And there is that communication that can happen there across squads as well within the communities. Okay, so yeah, and this is an interesting thing. So someone said, let's not pretend Spotify doesn't have some weird features and UI choices. You know what? I'm not, this wasn't here to judge sort of the end product of Spotify. And, in terms of some of the features and UI choices they have, it would be interesting to see. Oh yeah, someone says that the person who wrote that said didn't mean to sort of pile on to Spotify because they use it daily. Yeah, I mean, and it's one of those things, right, where it's interesting, and we'll actually get into stuff later where we talk about how do actually companies decide what features to keep and what features to get rid of, or what's the best design strategy for a given feature or a user interface. So we'll talk about that a little later in the course. But there are actually practices around that and around the decision making for that. So let's leave that there. And let's continue on with the lecture. What I'd ask you all to do is before next class, we'll spend a few minutes beginning of next class before I start the recording talking about part 2 of that Spotify engineering culture. So for those of you who didn't watch the video or didn't know they were posted as sort of homework for today, you can watch it for next class and we'll talk about it then. Okay, so where did we leave off before we went and looked at that little case study involving Spotify? Well, we actually were talking about the fact that Agile has a set of values and principles to guide and shape development, right? These aren't practices. These are the beliefs you should hold when deciding how you actually are going to develop software. And if you look at the development process you have now, the nice thing you can do is if you work in a company, if you've just done co-op, if you're, developing in an open source community, whatever it is, you can actually look at the practices and look at how you develop software. And you can compare it to these values and principles to see, would this qualify as Agile? Am I doing things that are related to Agile? And so it's kind of a nice thing to have values and principles because it can really help you to align what you're doing and see if it is actually in line with Agile or if it's in line with something else. So out of the different actual Agile development methods that you could look at, we're going to actually start by looking at extreme programming or XP, and we're going to spend some time on Scrum and Kanban over the next week. I want to spend a lot of time on these because these are actually, it's important that you know how to do them properly because that relates to quality and because they're widely used, and there's a lot of misunderstanding amongst some of these. And I think by seeing multiple different Agile development methods, you'll actually start seeing the commonality across them. And you can start seeing about the underlying values and principles and how those values and principles actually end up being embodied in some very similar practices. So let's talk about extreme programming a little bit. So extreme programming, this was sort of the first book I think that I saw about extreme programming. I think this was released in 2004. This is the second edition. The first edition was, I think, 2004 or 3. And this was the first book that actually talked about it. And one of the things that I found really interesting as a grad student at the time seeing this book was this note to programmers at the beginning where it says, even programmers can be whole people in the real world. XP is an opportunity to test yourself, to be yourself, to realize that maybe you've been fine all along and just hanging with the wrong crowd. And it's almost like a self-help commentary, right? And I think it's useful to see this because it makes you realize that a lot of, and I wasn't, I'm not on this Agile Manifesto. I wasn't one of the people in the room. I wasn't even doing software development when that was thought about. But it makes you realize that there probably was a lot of disillusionment with how software was being developed when developers came together and put together these values and principles. And they were probably put together because they didn't feel those values and principles themselves. And so in some ways, it almost sometimes with extreme programming, some of the early ones, they almost seem like, I don't know if self-help is the right word, but they almost seem like it's a support group for like recovering developers on how you can actually develop in a way where you actually feel valued and where you can have trust in your team and you can actually produce something that you care about. And that's what I find kind of interesting when you look at some of the older stuff on Agile. So extreme programming, it has its own values, principles, and practices, but largely the values and the principles overlap heavily with the Agile Manifesto. There are some slight variations, but in general, they're very similar. And the idea with the values is the values are supposed to bring purpose to practice, meaning you should be able to look at your practices and they should embody those values. And if they don't, then you're probably doing something that isn't aligned with what you want to be doing. And the types of values that they have in extreme programming are things like communication, which we've seen, simplicity, which we've seen, feedback. I don't think that was in there before, but is important. It's related to communication. Courage and respect, those weren't in there, but the word trust was in there before. But you're seeing some very similar values or related values in extreme programming to general Agile. And then in terms of the principles of XP, they have some similar ones, but they have some more specifics. One of them is humanity, that software is developed by people. They also have this principle that economics, software costs money. Well, yeah, that makes sense. They also say quality down the list can't be sacrificed. But they have some really other interesting ones. So some of these are sort of things you would know, but I think the idea is that if you put in these things like economics and quality in here, then what you're doing is you're saying that even though these, quality and economics are things that are probably valued in non-agile development, they're still things that we should value and are really important in Agile too. So it's important that all the principles don't just relate to Agile, what's different about Agile, but the things that are similar about Agile to traditional development should also be represented in the principles. Mutual benefit, so software activities should be beneficial to everybody. Self-similarity is this idea of trying to reuse across projects. Improvement, continuous improvement. So don't try to have the first version be perfect. Have the first version exist, and then each subsequent version should try to improve upon that. Another one that I think is really good to know, and this is something that I think doesn't get said enough, is about the importance of diversity in software teams. And they mention here about how different skills benefit a software team, but also different experiences. And so having a diverse backgrounds, diverse education, this diverse culture, these are all things that actually can strengthen a software team. And it's important to value that as a principle. And that's something that this does. And there's a whole bunch of other ones here, and I haven't listed them all because I don't want this lecture to go on forever, but those are some of the other principles as well. Okay, so a couple things there. Now that we've covered the values and principles, and remember, you can always jump in at any time if you're not sure about something I'm talking about. Happy to share. The other thing that they actually talk about is they go then into the practices. So at a high level, extreme programming, or XP, is meant to be a modern, lightweight, lean process. That word lean is interesting too, because have you heard of lean development versus agile development? Kinda. Okay, well, I'm not going to get into the lean side right now. What I'd encourage you to do, look up lean, and we've covered agile. Look up lean development, and if you find an interesting definition for it, post it in our Slack, and we'll discuss it offline. We'll discuss it there asynchronously. But it's an interesting word, and it's something we'll talk about a little later as well in the course. But in general, what they basically did was they came up with this process that recognized the realities of software and development. And there are 3 or 4 realities. One of them was timelines are often short. It never feels like you have enough time to develop what you have to develop. Expectations are never, it's never the case, expectations are always high. You're never the case where I'm not sure if, they really want us to do a good enough job on this. It's always the case that the client or the customer wants something that isn't achievable sometimes. Severe competition is another thing, right? There's not a saturation, but there are a lot of people developing a lot of different products, and apps. And if you think about any given app, so just did want to mention as well one thing. I'm just going to pause the video again. Okay, we're back. So what I wanted to do was just basically mention here that that we have severe competition, and then there's also this idea of rapidly changing requirements. Okay, where it's the case now often where the requirements aren't well known, and they're not necessarily always going to be exactly the same when you finish the product as when you started it. And another thing is that extreme programming is basically of continuous evolution of software, evolving, and it's meant to be practical, based on simplicity and testing as underlying things that you value. And the name extreme comes from an idea that it's taking all of the best practices that you think of in development and doing them to an extreme. Things like, and I'm only going to pick out a couple on this slide, but if testing is good, do testing all the time. If simplicity is good, always find the simplest solution. If short iterations are good, use the shortest iterations possible. So everything is done to the extreme. You do it to the best possible you can. So everything that's considered a best practice should be done to an extreme, as testing all the time, shortest iterations, architecture all the time, so on and so forth. So this is why it's called extreme. And then the other thing is that I mentioned this before. It sort of in some ways feels like a bit of a group sort of a group therapy or some sort of self-help book. And that's because it was born of a dissatisfaction with and frustration that developers had, where they felt they had a lack of time for doing what they felt were critical activities like testing. And they also felt they weren't being supported and instead were being blamed when deadlines were missed or when quality or expectations were missed. And they also felt that there was a gap between the technical staff, the programmers, developers who were actually doing a lot of the hands-on work, and the management who was overseeing that. And so they felt that the business side and the technical side weren't always working together. Okay, and then so with that in mind, they really strive to have things like continuous feedback, incremental planning, flexibility in scheduling, automation in testing, continuous collaboration. Another thing is they value the actual source code, and the tests are considered the primary communication at the programmer level. So you don't have other types of documentation. All the documentation is your tests and your source code. And then this idea of evolution and short-term practices that help yield long-term results. Those are all characteristics of XP. And they also believe in, I'm not going to talk about these because these are some slides I'm going to ask you to read on your own, but they also talk about attacking risks before they arise. And this is where it relates to quality, right? Some of the risks that you have in a development, they try to negate them before they happen. Things like schedule slips, i.e. going overtime on a given project. They do that by doing the short release cycles, by doing frequent intermediate versions and getting customer feedback constantly, right? They also avoid project cancellations, again, by doing small initial work, right? You add credibility. If you can release a version quickly and early, you'll have a lot more credibility with the customer or with your boss or with your client than if you haven't even released a version yet, but you're still asking for more time. Things like system defects being too high or degrading with maintenance, they actually have methods for dealing with that. They also have, and part of that has to do with the rigorousness of the testing and maintaining a comprehensive set of test suites. And they also talk about being misunderstood in terms of the business as being a risk that can happen. And that doesn't happen so much with XP because the software gets put in production early because of the early release. And the customer is actually part of the team, and the customer gives continuous feedback. And so the spec, the requirements continuously get refined, and therefore you're not going to end up in a situation where you're going to produce something that doesn't meet what the customer or the business wanted. Business changes. So this is the idea of requirements changing. This is addressed by short releases, customers giving you feedback as soon as possible, and refining the specification constantly and adapting it. Another thing is this featureitis. Have you guys heard of featureitis? Vaguely. So featureitis is basically when you just keep getting features added that aren't really essential, aren't really part of the requirements, but somebody thought it was a cool feature to add in, or someone thought, hey, this would be neat. And it's like, well, we don't actually need that. Yeah, it's feature creep is another thing. And this is addressed in XP by prioritizing tasks. And this is something you'll see in a lot of Agile. The whole set of requirements you have or the features you have, you prioritize them, and you always pick the highest priority features first. So any features that are considered, oh, this would be a cool thing, typically are going to be low, unless they really go towards what the requirements are. They're going to be a low priority feature. So therefore, they're only going to ever get built if you have tons of extra time. So by actually tackling high priority tasks and features first, you ensure that the things that get added on and the feature creep doesn't happen, because those features constantly get stuck at the bottom of your list and typically don't get addressed. Staff turnover is another thing that often can happen, which can wreak havoc on a development team and release dates and so on. And one of the things here is they try to do a couple things in XP built around happiness and satisfaction, and also built around frustration, mitigating frustration. So the first thing to mitigate frustration is they have, in XP, the programmers actually do their own estimates and their own schedules for how long things will take. And this is much different than being told you have 3 weeks to implement this or 2 weeks. They go and say, well, it will take 4 weeks to do this. And so they do their own estimates. Therefore, there's less frustration with the timing and less likely that people will quit because of being frustrated about time and schedules. And the same thing, this also goes along with what we talked about before with having a balance of work that doesn't ebb and flow between really high and really low amounts of work. The other thing that they do is they try to emphasize social interaction and minimize isolation and make sure that people feel supported. So if people are in a supportive environment, they're more likely to stay and less likely to leave and lead to risks in the product being released. With that in mind, there are a whole bunch of things which we call practices for XP. So there's primary practices, which are good practices to start with, and there are corollary practices, which are really good if you're already experienced with XP. And you don't have to implement all of the practices at once. You can start with one or two and then add to them. So it's really important, too, to not try to do everything all at once. So, if you're going to go full out into doing extreme programming as your development process, you would start with doing the principal or the primary ones first. Forget about the corollary. You could also take your existing process and add a few primary practices to get your team used to it before fully switching to something like XP, if you want to migrate from a non-agile to a semi-agile to a fully agile process. There's a couple things they do in here. One of them is they do something called stories, where rather than have like a feature or whatever, what they have is they have a unit of customer functionality, and a story has a name, a description, and an estimate. And these are often written on index cards, like we saw at Spotify, where they might have these stories on the wall, and they move from being to-dos to in progress to being done. They put them in a different place on the wall, and then visually you can see how many are there that are to do, how many have been done, and who's working on what ones. Because often those sticky notes, what they do in some XP teams, someone I know who worked in an XP team in the UK, they were in a glass sort of walled room. And on one side of the room, on one wall, they put all of the stories that had to be done. On the wall on the opposite side of the room, they put all the stories that had been completed. And whenever, in a given cycle, whenever somebody chose to work on a given story, they take the sticky note off the wall, the to-do wall, they go over and they put it on the edge of their display, or they put it on their desk, and then once they're done, it moves from their desk to the other wall. So that means that somebody walking by who's part of a different XP team or wanted to just understand how the team was doing can just look and see how many are to do, how many have been done, and who's working on what. And you can get a visual idea very quickly of how things are progressing. And those stories, I said they move them across. Well, those are done in cycles. So they have a weekly cycle and a quarterly cycle. And the weekly cycle is where they do 1 week planning. And in this case here, whatever they do is they have a weekly meeting where they discuss last week's actual versus expected progress, where they get to pick individually, get to pick stories to implement, and each story gets broken into tasks where there's effort and stuff. And that's what happens every week. And then every quarter, what they'll be doing is they will have a quarterly planning meeting where they reflect on larger goals and plan themes for that quarter. And the themes that they're going to address in a given quarter will dictate what stories they will actually be working on, right? So if the theme, one theme in one quarter might be increase user engagement, right? It might, if it's like a web-based, and that means focusing on stories and that are related to keeping users on the site longer, ensuring that users' needs are met, reducing frustration, whatever it is. And so those would be the types of stories related to the theme you're working on. And then they also talk different kind of Slack than the Slack tool we use, but they also plan for Slack. So they build Slack in, meaning that they never end up in this underestimation for the work. So there's always a bit of Slack so that if they've underestimated, they never really have to. So there's the amount of time they estimate plus the Slack time. So that way if they run out, they always some extra time. So yeah, this is a good question here. From the stories, how do we measure the difficulty of each task? More specifically, the stories that seem simple when assigned, but harder when it comes to doing. This is where you as an individual, if you kind of go back here, first off, there's two things. One of them is back on the stories, there was an estimate of the implementation effort. And that could be broken down in terms of how much they think it'll take per task, right? The other thing is that in the weekly cycle, each story, when it's broken into tasks and effort for each task is estimated, there's also, if you notice the bullet right above that, it says discuss last week's actual versus expected progress. In general, if you're doing your own estimation, you'll probably get pretty good at it. But there's always times where you may underestimate, which I think what you're talking about, where it's harder to do something than you thought. Well, that's where your actual and expected won't match. So it may be that in a given, because remember, you take the same theme over a quarter. It may be that a given task doesn't get completed in a given cycle. It might take 2 cycles. But the majority of them, there's an idea that you should actually get it done in the amount of time within this week. And that's partially where you want to break it up into tasks where it's enough bite-sized chunks that if there's enough people doing all these tasks, this feature will get implemented, this story will get done. If you break it down into tasks that are too big, it'll take too long. The other thing is you also put in the Slack here, so that way even if you did underestimate a bit, you've got a little bit of Slack there. I just only have a couple minutes left, so what I'm going to do is I'll be posting the video, so I'd encourage you, if you missed it, I do the video recording locally so you won't have any choppiness. Go back and watch that little bit again if you had for the answer to your question, rather than me repeating it, because I just want to wrap up really quickly, if that's okay. My apologies for that. Normally I would take more time. They also talk about something called a planning game. I'm going to leave this one for you to read about. The small releases, I'm also going to leave this one for you. So a lot of these practices, I want you to go back and take a look at these. And if you have questions about any given any given practice, we can discuss those with our with all the rest of the class on Slack. So they plan for small releases here. In our project, we're going to have roughly 2-week release intervals, okay? And the whole idea here is that you want to do new versions as quickly as possible. And you want to shrink the cycle to the next version as much as possible. Something else they do is they do something called pair programming. And this is when you have 2 people programming on the same computer. And I want to mention this one because you might think, well, this sounds kind of silly. But isn't this not less efficient than 2 people programming separately? But here's the difference. When you have 2 people programming together, one of them is doing we call tactical work, where they're actually writing the code. And the other one is doing strategic, where they're looking at how the code is being written, how it could be simplified, what kind of tests do we need, how could this code be refactored, redesigned, and so on. And the thing that it also does is, with the tactical versus strategic, is it actually tends to produce higher quality, and there are studies that have shown this, that it produces higher quality code. So what that means is that even though you may produce less code per hour than if you had those two people writing code separately, when you factor in the amount of testing time, refactoring, redesign time that you'd need when you're doing the separate, it's going to take more work after to get that code up to be high quality, bug-free, etc. So in the end, you may actually be slower writing the code, but the code comes out higher quality and therefore requires less time later. They also do test-driven development, which is key to what we're doing. And this is the last thing I'll be saying today. You write your tests first. And we're going to be doing that in our project where I'm going to give you a requirements doc. You'll create test cases for it. Then we'll write the code and see if the code matches the tests. And that's called test-driven development and test-driven programming. So we'll be doing that. And the last couple are incremental design, coding standards, continuous integration, 10-minute builds, and then there's a whole bunch of other practices which I'm not going to go into. But what I want to point out to you is that all of these practices here, you can actually, if you go to, I think, extremeprogramming.org, I believe is the website, you can find most of these. If you just Google extreme programming, you can find all of these listed. But all these practices are around ensuring that you achieve the values and the principles of Agile and extreme programming. And there's the website there where you can find all of these practices in detail. You can also review them on the slides that are on the course website, which is also linked from the YouTube channel. Okay, so thank you very much. That's a little bit about an overview of Agile. We did the case study on Spotify, and then we talked about extreme programming as our first example of a lean, programmer-centric Agile development method. Next class, we'll go and we'll actually look at another method, which will be Scrum. Have a great day.